When objects began to move in the Bowen's house, Frank, the father, accused his daughters of having orchestrated the whole thing. But who knew that the evil spirit the girls had summoned during a séance was real? In the autumn of 1986, Frank Bowen, along with his two daughters, 15-year-old Tina and 9-year-old Karen, suffered a terrible loss. The girl's mother died suddenly of cancer. This was a great tragedy, not only emotionally, but also financially. The girl's parents had worked hard to make ends meet, and now the entire burden of providing for the family rested on Frank's shoulders. With the girls left without their mother, their father mainly wanted to be there for them, support them, and somehow comfort them. But instead, he was forced to work overtime, take night shifts, and work on weekends just to keep the family afloat. Not long after his wife's burial, Frank stayed late at work, and his poor girls, crushed by grief and longing for their mother, were alone at home. The sisters sat in the living room, telling stories, remembering the happy times when Mom was still there, and they were sad. They missed her desperately. The only thing that mattered to them at that moment was to communicate once more with the closest person on earth. Due to their age, they couldn't quite believe that their mother had left them and would never come back. The girls' entire lives were turned upside down in an instant. And on that evening, when the sisters were alone at home, they had such an irresistible need to talk to their mother that they decided to hold a séance. Actually, they didn't expect anything fantastic to happen. They just wanted to distract themselves from their sorrow and timidly hoped that their mother would answer them. The girls had a Ouija board, which is basically used to speak with the dead. The board looked like a game board and was inscribed with letters and numbers, as well as the words yes, no, and goodbye. The set had a wooden planchette, which the spirits could use to answer the questions posed. The sisters went down to the basement and did what they thought should be done during a Ouija session. They lit candles, held hands, and even sang a few songs. They didn't really take what they were doing seriously, but deep down they hoped for a miracle. What if Mom had something to say to them? The girls placed their fingers on the wooden planchette and began to ask questions in a whisper. If the spirit of the deceased was in the room, it should theoretically have moved the pointer board and given signs. No matter how much the sisters pleaded with their mother to answer them, nothing happened. The planchette did not move. They waited, reformulated the questions, hoping that they would at least get a hint that she could hear them, and so on and so forth, but all in vain. The girls were disappointed. They wanted so badly to believe that their mother was there and watching over them, but for some reason she didn't want to show herself. After putting the Ouija board away, they went upstairs to their rooms. The failed séance with the other world was another reminder that Mom was truly gone. She was dead. The girls crawled into their beds and tried to sleep. Since Daddy was still at work, they had to cope with their daily routine alone. Tina and Karen couldn't sleep, but suddenly, at some point, they both heard a knocking coming from below, either from the ground floor or the basement. The knocking was inconspicuous, like a mechanism working loudly, the sound of which was more clearly heard in the silence of the night, or like tree branches outside hitting the side of the house in the wind. Both girls lay in their beds, listening and trying to guess where the sound was coming from. And if it didn't bother them at first, the younger Karen felt a kind of fear. So she got out of bed, looked out of her room, and tiptoed across the hallway to her older sister's room. Tina was also awake and wanted to find out where the knocking was coming from. The girls went to the stairs and began to listen. Dad wasn't home yet, so they didn't risk going downstairs. They simply stood on the landing on the first floor and tried to understand the reason for the strange noises. At some point, one of the girls suggested that the knocking sound might be coming from Mom. What if the Ouija session they had done had worked, and Mom had appeared to them when called and was now giving them signs? The sisters' excitement suddenly grew. One of them quietly asked, "Mommy, is that you?" And at the same moment, there was a soft knock. Tina and Karen looked at each other and repeated the question, and again there was a soft knock, exactly like the first time. It was frightening, but at the same time, it was what they wanted, what they held the session for. They needed some time with their mother. The girls were sure that the spirit of the dead woman was answering them at that moment, but that no longer terrified them. The sisters became excited, and in their excitement ran downstairs and asked more and more questions. They had already realized that the sound was coming from the basement. It seemed as if Mom had been in the house with them the entire time. She just didn't know how to show herself so as not to scare her daughters. When they opened the basement door, Tina and Karen stopped. Although they were sure that their mother was talking to them, for some reason they were afraid to go down the stairs. The girls kept asking questions and got answers in the form of knocks from the dark basement, and after about 20 to 30 minutes, everything stopped abruptly. No matter how much the girls urged their mother to come back and continue talking, there was no sound in response. Tina and Karen were so excited that they didn't notice their father coming home. Frank was very surprised when his daughters ran towards him, excitedly telling him about a kind of séance. The clock struck midnight, and for some reason the girls hadn't gone to bed yet. With shining eyes, they told their father the story of how they had communicated with their dead mother and how she had answered them by knocking. Honestly, the man was confused. However, he knew that his daughters were going through a very difficult time in their lives after the loss of their mother, and for the first time in the short period since the burial, he saw that the girls were genuinely happy. Frank was undeterred and determined to protect and care for them. Satisfied that they had found a way to talk to their mother, Tina and Karen finally went to bed, and the tired Frank assumed that this was a defense mechanism of the children's psyche. His girls were slowly learning to cope with the terrible loss. In the following days, the strange noises in the house continued. Now the soft knocking no longer came only from the basement, but from the kitchen, the living room, sometimes from the first floor, from everywhere. However, the girls were the only ones who heard the knocking. For example, if Frank was at home, Mom's ghost did not answer for some reason. Their father was even convinced that the daughters had invented a kind of game to get used to the fact that their mother was no longer there. He even played along a bit with Tina and Karen. But when the knocking continued a few days after the session, the girls began to change their attitude towards these strange noises. While at first they were quite sure they were communicating with their mother, doubts now crept in, and the sisters began to feel afraid. Gradually, the sounds shifted from the basement to the first floor and came exclusively from their bedrooms at night.
The sisters lay in their beds and heard strange knocking sounds under the bed, from the wardrobe, or from above. Now it was really scary, and they complained to their father that the ghost was keeping them from sleeping. Frank went into the bedrooms, examined the wardrobes, looked under the beds, but found nothing. The man tried to talk to the children and explain to them that the knocking was just a figment of their imagination. He assured his daughters that while their mother's soul was with them, it could not manifest itself in the physical world. But instead of calming down, Karen and Tina claimed that the séance had let a strange evil spirit into the house, which was now bothering them. At this point, Frank decided that if this didn't stop, he would send the girls for grief counseling. After a short time, the sisters became afraid to stay at home alone, especially at night. Frank tried to invite friends over and leave the girls with relatives, but that couldn't go on forever. One evening, when the sisters were alone at home, there was knocking again, but this time it seemed to be coming from downstairs. The girls were sitting in the kitchen, preparing their dinner. The knocking was slowly becoming bothersome and annoying. The older sister, Tina, suggested that since Dad didn't believe them, they should deal with this evil spirit alone. The schoolgirl grabbed a kitchen knife and went with her sister to the basement. It was damn scary, but the girls finally wanted to deal with the strange noises from the afterlife. The sisters carefully went down the basement stairs and reassured themselves. They hoped to find the real cause and speculated that it could have been a raccoon, a cat, or another animal that had gotten into the house. When the girls went down to the lowest step, they looked at a few boxes of unnecessary things, and that was all. No animal, no person, no one making noises downstairs, and they became afraid again. After a few minutes, the sisters turned around and were about to go back up the stairs when they noticed a message written in the wall in red paint. It read, "I am in your closet. Come and find me." Tina and Karen stormed up the stairs screaming, jumped out of the house, and ran to a neighbor. Their neighbor was about to go to bed when there was a knock at the door. Slightly surprised, he opened the lock and saw the sisters. Confused, the girls told him about a kind of spiritualist session, an evil spirit, strange knocking sounds, and an incomprehensible inscription in the basement. The confused neighbor, who didn't know how to react, simply invited the girls to come in and wait for their father, who was returning home from work. When Frank Bowen returned late at night from work, he was called by the neighbor. The man explained that the girls had been scared by noises in the house and an unclear inscription in the basement, and therefore had run to him. Tina and Karen's father explained to the neighbor that the daughters had become very nervous after the death of their mother and were afraid of every noise. Bowen assured him that he would check the house immediately and convince himself that there was no reason to panic. Of course, Frank knew that the girls' games with the other world had negatively affected their psyche. Deep down, he blamed himself. He should have taken the children's fantasies more seriously from the beginning and stopped further discussions on the subject. But he had made a mistake, and now the situation was out of control. The man was more than sure that apart from his daughters, there was no one in the house. Probably, Tina and Karen had decided to play a trick on him and make him believe that an evil spirit had spoken to them. Frank went into the house and searched all the rooms, the kitchen, the wardrobes, and the basement. On the wall of the basement, he found a sign that read, "I am in your closet. Come and find me," made with ketchup. But apart from the strange inscription, no one and nothing was in the house. The father decided that his children might be trying to get his attention in this way. Their mother had died, and he himself was working all the time, while his daughters were bored alone. Bowen returned to his neighbor's house, took the children with him, and decided to have a serious talk with them. Annoyed, the father explained that they had played so much with ghosts that they themselves believed in their existence. The father explained to his daughters that the longing for their mother was causing them to invent and do things that did not exist. Frank did not bother to find out why they had painted the basement walls, as he considered it a prank, and promised to take them to a therapist tomorrow who would support them in their grief. Apparently, he believed that Tina and Karen needed professional help, as they could not cope with the loss of their mother alone. In a way, the girls agreed with their father, because they were the only ones who had heard the strange knocking in the house. The only thing that worried them was that none of them had written on the basement wall. As promised, Frank took the children to a specialist the next day. From that day on, all the strange knocking in the house stopped. No one left strange messages in the rooms. It was quiet and peaceful. Everything stood still, as if the world had returned to the Bones house. On December 8, 1986, 3 weeks after the girls started therapy, Frank went to the cafe with Tina, Karen, and their friend Kathleen to eat ice cream. The girls were just getting used to having only their father as a parent and were having a lot of fun. They didn't get home until after dark. When the Bones drove to the house, they were surprised that the lights in the house were still on. Had they really forgotten to turn them off before they left? Frank went onto the porch, opened the front door, and immediately saw a strange scene inside that made no sense. The TV and radio were on. The furniture on the ground floor of the house had obviously been moved, turned to the other side, and some things were simply not where they usually stood. Frank looked around the rooms on the ground floor and looked back at the girls in surprise. Could it be that they were still playing these creepy games with the ghost? Tina and Karen were with him the whole time. They couldn't have caused the mess in the house. But a stranger wouldn't do something like that either, because nothing was missing from the house. It was just an inexplicable wildness. Instead of leaving the house and calling the police, as anyone else would have done, Frank casually went into the house and began searching the rooms to find the person who had caused the chaos. Tina, Karen, and their friend Kathleen hid behind the man's back and followed him. Bowen turned off the TV and radio, moved the living room furniture back, and tidied up everything else. He walked around the entire ground floor and found no one. Then Frank went to the first floor and began systematically searching the bedrooms. The three girls crouched together anxiously and followed the man because they were scared. The first floor was also empty. They searched the attic in the same way and then went down to the basement, but they didn't find anyone there either. Frank stood with the girls in the middle of the living room and didn't understand what was going on. All the windows and doors were locked and there were no signs of a break-in. Who could have broken into their house and rearranged it? And why was this done? It wasn't a ghost, after all, was it? The man realized that they hadn't checked another room on the ground floor. It was a small room right next to the main entrance with windows facing the street. There was almost nothing in it, just an old built-in closet that Bowen had wanted to dismantle a long time ago, but hadn't managed to. The room had not been used, so the man had not paid much attention to it. Now he stood in front of the door and thought that if no one was there, then the whole house had been checked and they were safe. Frank cautiously opened the door and looked inside. Directly in front of him, written on the wall with shaving cream, was, "I am in your closet." Dad asked the girls to stay outside and walked over to the inscription. At first he thought it was another stupid joke of his daughter's. Frank looked back at them, and at that moment he heard an unusual rustling sound in the closet. The closet doors slowly opened, and in the darkness, Bowen saw a man. He was a young man with clown makeup on, dressed in Frank's dead wife's dress and a blonde wig, and he was holding an axe. As soon as the stranger took a step toward the homeowner, the father ordered the girls to quickly run upstairs and lock themselves in the bedroom, and in the meantime he himself blocked the madman's path. A fight ensued between the two, during which Frank managed to push the intruder away. Bowen immediately rushed upstairs to the girl's bedroom and locked the door, because the intruder didn't seem to have any intention of retreating. The older girl, Tina, realized that they were trapped and climbed out the window and down from the first floor to the ground. Although she didn't feel any pain during the unfortunate landing, she ran to the nearest neighbors screaming that a criminal had broken into their house. The police arrived only a few minutes later. They saw Frank at the window on the first floor of the Bones house, screaming that the intruder was somewhere in the house, that he wanted to break down the door to their bedroom. But when he heard the police sirens, he disappeared somewhere. The officers placed a ladder against the first floor window. Frank and the two girls climbed down. They were unharmed, but very scared. Only after the owner and the children had left the house safely did the police officers enter the house with arms drawn.
They were searched the entire building for the man with clown makeup and an axe in his hand, but they didn't find anyone in the house. The axe was lying next to the rear sliding glass door, which was partially open. The officers concluded that the intruder had fled. The officers spoke to the head of the family, Frank, and asked him to stay with relatives for a while. They themselves promised to monitor the property around the clock and just see what happens next. The investigators also wanted to find out who might have attacked the family, and to do this, they wanted to check old criminal records. Frank and the girls stayed with a friend for a while. Nothing happened for 2 days. No one entered or left the Bones' house. The police searched the city and checked former inmates, but there were no leads for the investigation. 48 hours after the attack, Frank decided to stop by his house to pick up some of his belongings. They had been in such a hurry to stay somewhere else that they had forgotten to take some things with them. The man hoped to meet law enforcement officers who were supposed to be watching the house. However, no one was nearby. Frank got out of the car and walked to the front door of his own house.
Out of the corner of his eye, he noticed movement at the window on the first floor. The owner briefly considered that the police might have been lying in wait for him inside, but was very surprised that he had not been warned. He went to his neighbor's house and called the investigator handling the case. The investigator explained that they were watching the house from the outside, that an officer had left the house and was supposed to be replaced by another. Frank hung up the phone, went outside, and actually saw a car in which a police officer was sitting. After the officer heard the homeowner's story, he was very surprised. He explained that in the 48 hours they had been guarding his house, no one had entered it. To be on the safe side, they decided to check the situation. When the police officer opened the door of the Bones' house and glanced inside, he immediately realized that someone had been there. He called for backup, and several officers searched all the rooms, both floors, the attic, and the basement with their weapons drawn. Again, they found no one, but this time too, they were convinced that the intruder had definitely entered the house. The furniture had been moved. A knife had been stabbed into a photo hanging on the wall, and the walls were covered with strange inscriptions. "I'm back. Find me if you can. You will die soon," and the like. The investigators also searched the exterior area. There were no strange footprints in the snow. Assuming that Frank had actually seen someone in the house, this meant that the perpetrator was still hiding in the house. After several hours of searching, the officers stopped in the basement. The police officers were just discussing among themselves what they might have overlooked when one of the officers leaned against the washing machine. The device moved slightly, and a gap became visible in the wall behind it. When the officer shone a flashlight into the depths, he saw a youth in the corner behind the wall. The boy was pulled out of the wall and taken to the police station. Daniel LaPlante was born on May 16, 1970, in the small town of Townshend on the outskirts of Boston, Massachusetts. The boy had a difficult, traumatic childhood in which he was physically and psychologically abused and mistreated by his father and stepfather. Recently, he had been living with his mother, stepfather, and 2 brothers. The harsh upbringing had consequences. The boy grew up to be an aggressive, unsociable person who bullied his classmates and never went to school parties or spoke to anyone in particular. At school, Daniel suffered from learning difficulties due to dyslexia. Dyslexia is a learning disorder characterized by difficulties in reading and writing. As a teenager, the boy was also diagnosed with attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. When he was taken to a psychiatrist, the teenager was even more traumatized. The doctor took advantage of the minor patient's reluctance and began to harass him. Daniel had almost no friends. His classmates considered him strange. The boy was unkempt, constantly came to school in dirty clothes, and smelled bad. As a result, the other students tried to avoid him. Instead of spending his time like most teenagers, Daniel began to sneak into other people's houses. His aim was less about stealing and more about driving the owners crazy. He snuck in and intentionally moved things around, shifted furniture, and left empty drink cans visible somewhere. He liked to watch people get nervous and not understand what was going on. One day, Daniel broke into the Bones' house and saw 15-year-old Tina in a photo. He liked her very much. He got her phone number and started calling. LaPlante introduced himself as a friend of Tina's classmate. He described himself as a good-looking young man, and the teenagers talked on the phone for a while. Then, they arranged a date. Tina was very nervous because she wanted to meet her new acquaintance. When the doorbell rang, she hurried to open the door and was surprised to be frozen on the doorstep. The young man did not look at all like he had described himself in the phone conversation. Standing in front of her was a small, thin teenager with messy hair. His face was covered in pimples. The girl tried to hide her disappointment and went for a walk anyway. She told Danny about her family and mentioned that her mother had recently died of cancer. She felt quite uncomfortable when the young man started asking about the details of her mother's death. After spending about an hour with him, the schoolgirl said goodbye and made it clear that there would be no second meeting. At that moment, 16-year-old Danny decided to act differently. He snuck back into the Bones' house and hid in the basement in the spaces between the walls. He set up a kind of secret hideout. Later, numerous items were found in the basement, including a sleeping bag, beer cans, and several items of clothing that had been stolen from the homeowner's wardrobes. A young man of slight build could safely move into the basement and part of the ground floor by moving through the spaces between the walls. To gain access to other rooms, he left his hideout and hid in different parts of the house. All of this happened over a period of several weeks. When the family was at home, Danny stayed in his hideout. As soon as they left the house, he came out and simply wandered around the house, sometimes rearranging a few items or simply watching TV. When the girls held the séance to contact their mother, Danny was downstairs in the basement. First, he just watched the sisters, and then he came up with the idea of pretending to be the spirit of the deceased and giving a signal. That's how the schoolgirls heard the knocking. But when Frank came home from work, he naturally stopped knocking. That led the father to think that his daughters were only imagining it. When Danny realized that the sisters were afraid of the signals from the other side, he became bolder and hid in the sisters' rooms to scare them even more. He could hear what they were talking about, so he could anticipate their actions, and knew that they wouldn't look for him because they were afraid. One day, he disguised himself as the dead wife and suddenly heard a car drive up to the house. He didn't have time to hide in the basement, so he hid in the closet and took an axe with him just in case. It is not known what the teenager was thinking at that moment when he used the axe to break down the bedroom door where the residents of the house had barricaded themselves. However, he heard police sirens and managed to escape to the basement, barricading the entrance with the washing machine. That's how Daniel was pulled out of his hiding place and arrested. He was taken to a juvenile detention center where he waited 10 months for his trial.
In May 1987, Daniel was released on bail. His trial for trespassing and armed assault was scheduled to take place in December 1987, but it didn't happen because the teenager had other plans. The stay in a juvenile detention center had no effect on the boy's character. When he was released on bail, he broke into his neighbor's house and stole firearms from him, 2 pistols. On the afternoon of December 1, 1987, Daniel LaPlante, armed with a pistol, broke into the home of the Gustafson family in Townsend. But this time, he decided not to play with the residents of the house, but to proceed in a more drastic way. The Gustafson family consisted of 4 people, but was expecting another baby in the near future. Living in the house were 30-year-old Priscilla, who was pregnant with her 3rd child, her 35-year-old husband Andrew, and 2 children, 7-year-old Abigail and 5-year-old William. Andrew was a lawyer and his wife was a middle school teacher. She sang in the church choir and was deeply devoted to her Christian faith. When Andrew came home from work that day around 7 o'clock, the rooms were dark and there was an ominous silence. He went up the stairs and entered the marital bedroom, where a horrific sight awaited him. There was blood everywhere. Priscilla was lying face down on the bed. Her head was covered with a pillow. The woman was dead. Fearing what he would see next, Andrew ran out of the house and called the police. He couldn't bear the thought that his children might have been killed in the same way. The police officers found the bodies of 5-year-old William and 7-year-old Abigail in separate bathrooms. They had been drowned. In the master bedroom, 2 .22 caliber shell casings, an open beer can, and semen stains were found on the bedding. Apparently, the woman had been shot with a pillow over her face and subsequently abused. Several items were missing from the apartment, including a cable television set-top box and a cordless phone. The alleged intruder had left shoe prints in the flower bed in front of the house. The whole town was shocked by the massacre at the Gustafson home. No one could understand who had committed such a heinous crime, who had laid hands on innocent children and a pregnant woman. The investigators had to compile a list of possible suspects. Daniel LaPlante was also on this list, as he had previously committed crimes against the Bowen family. When the officers came to question him, the boy was standing on the porch. As soon as he saw the police, he ran away and hid in the woods. Obviously, he had something to hide. When the investigators searched the house, they found several pieces of evidence linking Daniel to the crime. 2 .22 caliber shell casings were found in the Gustafsons' house, matching the 2 casings from the crime scene, and then the weapon itself, hidden in the glove compartment of an old car. In Daniel's wardrobe, there was a pair of sneakers that matched the footprints in the flower bed in front of the Gustafsons' house. Although DNA technology was still in its infancy at the time, a later laboratory analysis of Daniel's blood showed that he was a type A secretor. The semen stain on Priscilla's bed also belonged to a man who was a type A secretor. The police issued a search warrant, and the search for the suspect began.
Several dozen officers, service dogs, and a police helicopter were deployed. During his escape, Danny got into a woman's car at gunpoint and forced her to drive him out of town. The driver managed to trick the man. She immediately called the police and provided the make and license plate of her car that Danny fled with. At that time, several other people had already reported to emergency services that they had seen Daniel. Thanks to the public's help, the authorities found the teenager on December 3, 2 days after the crime. He had hidden in a dumpster at a sawmill, about 18 kilometers from Townsend. At the time of his arrest, Daniel was laughing hysterically, which confused the police officers. They found a weapon on him that he had hidden in his underwear. He had no reason to take the lives of the Gustafsons. He broke into their house and at some point decided to kill everyone present, simply because he felt like it. If Tina Bowen hadn't jumped out of the window on the first floor and called the police from the neighbor's house, Daniel probably would have sent them to their graves too. He was later charged with the massacre of Priscilla, Abigail, and William Gustafson, in addition to the charges related to his crimes against the Bowen family. Daniel pled not guilty to all charges. His trial began in October 1988, when the boy turned 18 years old. He was to be tried as an adult. Although he was still a minor at the time of his criminal acts, psychiatric reports showed that he understood the consequences of his actions and was capable of standing trial. During the hearing, the defendant showed no remorse, but merely smiled to himself. Far from regretting the death of a pregnant woman and her 2 children, he seemed to find the whole thing amusing. Daniel LaPlante was found guilty on all counts and sentenced to 3 consecutive life sentences. Over the years, he filed appeals, all of which were rejected. After the Supreme Court ruled that juveniles cannot be sentenced to life without parole, LaPlante found hope. In 2017, 47-year-old Daniel LaPlante appealed and asked for a sentence reduction. At the hearing to review the verdict, the convicted man apologized to the Gustafson family for the first time. He said he was sincerely sorry for what he had done and lacked the words to fully express his deep sorrow. However, those present felt that the apology was superficial and insincere. Danny was apparently only doing what they wanted him to say. He kept a stony face during the apology and did not even make eye contact with the relatives of the Gustafson family. The judge upheld LaPlante's sentence. His story of his crimes was widely covered in the media and in documentaries about real crimes. Today, at the age of 54, Daniel remains incarcerated in the Massachusetts Correctional Facility, where he will stay until at least 2032. Only after that can he be released on parole. Look closer. Perhaps a stranger is also living in your house, watching every move you make. Thank you for watching, and take care of yourselves.